In our lesson for November the 9th, we come to the best known and most loved chapter in the book of Hebrews, one that all of us know about, and that is the great chapter on faith. So what is faith? One tongue-in-cheek definition describes faith as, here's the quote, belief without evidence in what is told by one who speaks without knowledge about things without parallel. It's a little bit negative understanding of faith. Another little boy I heard one time said, faith means believing what you know ain't so. Well, that's not faith. Faith is something that gives content and direction to our lives, and nowhere in the Scripture do we have a better explanation of what faith is than in our text for this week's lesson in Hebrews chapter 11. The writer of Hebrews begins chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, with what I call a description of faith. Now, at first glance, when the writer of Hebrews opens chapter 11, verse 1 by saying, now faith is, we expect him to give a definition of faith. But instead, he gives a description of faith. In other words, as he begins here, he's not telling us what faith is, he's telling us what faith does. And it's only when he gets down to verse 6 that he actually gives us that definition, and we'll look at that a little bit later in this lesson. He begins then with what I call a description of faith. Not an explanation of what faith is, but a revelation of what faith does. And notice on your outline some things that I've spelled out for us. Under number 2 there, first description. Faith provides the foundation for our assurance that God has more for us than what we have already experienced. He says faith is being sure of what we hope for. Being sure of what we hope for. Faith is connected in this way to hope. Faith is the ability to look to the future and know that God has more for us in the future than we can see at the present time. Paul expressed that same idea in Philippians chapter 3, verse 12, where he said, not that I have already obtained all of this or have already been made perfect, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. That's what faith does. Faith enables us to look to the future and see that God, our hope, that God has more for us in the future than we experience right now. And then a second thing, faith provides the foundation for our confidence that there is more to life, this is number 3, this is more to life than what we can see with our physical eyes. He says in verse 1, faith is being sure of what we hope for, that was the first thing, and being certain of what we do not see. The biblical writers over and over again remind us that the real world is not the world we see with our physical eyes. There is another world, another dimension that we can't see with our physical eyes, but that is just as real, or we might even say more real than this physical world. Paul focuses on this in 2 Corinthians 4:18 when he says, so we fix our eyes on not what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen, that is the physical world, is temporary. But what is unseen, that is the spiritual world, is permanent. Now the Bible refers to this other dimension as the spiritual dimension of life, and it's faith that enables us to get connected to this spiritual dimension. Now, after describing the two dimensions of faith, he says in verse 2, this is what the ancients were commended for. This is what the ancients were commended for. Now, they were the ones who hoped that God had more for them in the future. They were the ones who saw the spiritual reality around them in addition to the physical reality. In other words, they were the ones who had faith. But they didn't realize their goal, all of them. If you go through the book of or chapter 11, you'll see that many of them died, many of them were persecuted, many of them didn't reach those goals, but their faith pointed them to that future. Their faith pointed them to that spiritual dimension, even though they did not completely experience it in this life. Verse 3, the writer completes the temporal scope of faith when he says, when he turns to the past and he says, verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So the writer of Hebrews is giving us a threefold dimension of what faith does. Faith points us to the past and reminds us that all that is came into being because of the Creator God. Faith points us to the future and reminds us that there is much more for us in the days ahead than we have already experienced. Faith also points us to the present and reminds us that there are things going on around us that we cannot see with our physical eyes. This, the writer of Hebrews says, is what faith does. Now, beginning in verse 4, he gives us a demonstration, a couple of examples of how this faith that we've been talking about points to the future, points to the past, points to the present, and how it makes a difference in a person's life. And he uses two examples. In verse 4, he refers to Abel. He says in verse 4, by faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, he still speaks even though he is dead. Now you have to go back to Genesis 4, verses 3 through 5 to get the historical setting for this. And the story there is that both Cain and Abel wanted to give a sacrifice to God, but God accepted Abel instead of Cain's. Why? Because the writer of Hebrews says it was a better sacrifice. Why was it a better sacrifice? Because the writer of Hebrews says he offered that sacrifice by faith. When Abel offered his sacrifice to God, he was aware of the future that God had for him. He was aware of the spiritual world that was around him. He was aware that this was the created world of God. He presented it by faith, and therefore that faith led him to a better worship. That's the first example. The second example is Enoch, chapter 11, verses 5 through 6. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. But before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Enoch walked with God and was not because God took him. That's the way the King James expresses it. I love the story of a little girl who was asked to explain that verse, and she read it and she thought about it and she said, well, I guess one day Enoch took a walk and God came to him and said, Enoch, you're closer to my house than you are to yours, so why don't you come on with me? And Enoch did. Now, that's a pretty good description of what the biblical writer says. Enoch had faith, recognized the future that God had for him, recognized the spiritual world around him, recognized that God had created all that was, and because of that faith, he was able to develop a more intimate relationship with God that enabled him to simply be transcended into the heavenly presence of God. A better worship, faith brought for Abel. A better relationship, faith brought for Enoch. Two examples of what faith does. Now, the last part of our lesson, finally, in verse 6, the writer of Hebrews comes to what we might call a definition of faith. Verse 6, and without faith, it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. So there's your definition of what faith is. Faith means to believe that God exists, and this is my translation, to believe that it is worthwhile to follow Him, that He's going to reward those who follow Him. Now, two aspects of that definition I want us to look at for a moment. First of all, faith believes that God exists. Faith says, I believe that God is there, and I'm putting my faith in Him. Now, everybody believes in something and puts their faith in it. Some people believe in their money and put their faith in that. Some people believe in their skills and put their faith in that. Some people believe in their friends and put their faith in that. The writer of Hebrews says that Christian faith is faith that is placed in God. It believes that God exists. Now, this is more than just a theological conclusion. It is basically a lifestyle. We look at the world and we decide that God exists and we're going to live our life accordingly. That's the first dimension of faith. Now, the second part, faith also assumes that it's worth our while to follow Him. In other words, the writer of Hebrews says, faith believes that God exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. Now, this is not a crass quid pro quo, I believe in God and therefore He makes my life easy and fills my life with riches. How do we know that's not what the writer of Hebrews is talking about? All we have to do is read the rest of the chapter and know that that's not what he's talking about. Because he will go on in chapters 35 to 37, for example, to talk about these men of faith and what happens to them. Well, they're tortured, they face jeers and flogging, they're put in prison, they're sawed in two, they're put to death by the sword. All of these things that happen to them, and yet they are men who demonstrate their faith. So it doesn't mean that God's going to bless our lives. It means that we recognize that the only way to experience the fullness of life is to believe in Him and to live our life accordingly. So what the writer of Hebrews is talking about here is a world view. We wake up every morning, we look at the world and we say, we believe that this is God's world, that He exists, that He created this world, and that the best way we can live is to put our faith in Him. And that lifestyle will determine our priorities, our goals, our values, our relationships. It is a lifestyle and not just a theological assumption. So he talks about what faith does, he gives some demonstrations of faith, and then he reminds us of what faith is. Some conclusions, I've spelled them out at the bottom. Faith is not a leap in the dark. It's based on the conclusion that God is at work and this is His world. It's not just words. We see that evidently from the examples given in this chapter. And it's not just a modern day phenomenon. The writer of Hebrews in this galaxy of faith gives us some of the great examples of faith through the years, and we should follow their example as we live our lives of faith today.